6 weeks. That's how long it took for something as ordinary as a parking space to turn into one of the ugliest battles I've ever had with a group of grown adults. And the craziest part is that none of it had to happen. I never wanted anyone fined, embarrassed, or publicly called out. I just wanted to get my son safely from my van to his classroom. Somehow, that was asking too much. My name is Daniel Mercer, and I live in a quiet suburb outside Columbus, Ohio. The kind of place where people wave when they mow their lawns, where everyone says they support families, inclusion, and community, at least until supporting those things requires giving up 8 minutes of convenience. My 12-year-old son, Ethan, was born with cerebral palsy. If you've never cared for someone who uses a wheelchair, it's hard to explain how every tiny detail becomes part of a carefully rehearsed routine. Parking isn't just parking. It's angles, clearance, ramp space, sidewalk grades, weather, traffic, and timing. Every morning and every afternoon is almost like setting up a small engineering project. Except the project is getting your child through the school doors without unnecessary pain or frustration. Fortunately, Jefferson Ridge Elementary understood that. Years earlier, after working with the district's accessibility office, they created a designated accessible parking space directly beside the main entrance. It wasn't just painted blue. It had extra width for the wheelchair ramp, clear signage, curb access, and district registration. There was absolutely no confusion about who that space existed for. The principal, Mrs. Evelyn Brooks, had personally shown it to me before Ethan's first day and smiled as she said, "If you ever have any problems, Daniel, you let me know." At the time, I couldn't imagine anyone having a problem with a handicap parking space. Looking back now, I almost laugh at how naive I was. It started on a Tuesday afternoon in early September. School dismissal always turned the parking lot into organized chaos. Parents lined up 20 minutes early. Kids ran everywhere. Crossing guards blew whistles that nobody seemed to hear. And SUVs crawled through the pickup lane, my cattle heading toward a gate. I pulled into the lot at my usual time and immediately noticed a white luxury crossover sitting in my space. Engine running. Hazard lights blinking as if flashing lights magically turned illegal parking into acceptable parking. I rolled down my window and waited politely. The driver never looked up from her phone. Finally, I tapped my horn once, just enough to get her attention. She lowered her window halfway and looked annoyed before I even spoke. "Excuse me," I said with a smile. "That's the accessible space. I need to unload my son's wheelchair." She glanced toward the blue sign, then back at me with the kind of expression people wear when they think everyone else's problem is somehow an inconvenience to them. "I'm just waiting," she replied. "My twins will be out in a minute." I nodded politely. "I understand, but I can't get my ramp down while you're here." She shrugged. "Well, it'll only take a couple minutes." Those couple minutes became nearly 10. I watched dozens of children stream out of the building while Ethan quietly looked out the passenger window. He never complained. He almost never did. He just looked at me and softly asked, "Dad, are we okay?" That question hurt more than anything the woman could have said. I smiled and lied. "Yeah, buddy, we're okay." Eventually, her children climbed into the SUV. She drove away without another glance. Emma finally parked. I told myself it was probably just someone who didn't understand. People make mistakes. I believe that. At least I used to. The following Monday, she was back. Same vehicle, same spot, same excuse. "I'm only here for a minute." By the end of that week, another parent in a gray minivan copied her. Then a black pickup truck. Then another SUV. It was almost like once one person decided the rules didn't matter, everyone else concluded they didn't matter either. The blue paint stopped meaning handicap parking and became what parents jokingly called the best pickup spot in the lot. I overheard one father laugh to another. "If you're quick enough, nobody says anything, except somebody did." Me. Every single time. Politely, calmly, never yelling, never insulting anyone. Most barely acknowledged me. A few rolled their eyes. One woman actually laughed and said, "Relax. You're acting like you own the place." I wanted to tell her that I didn't own the parking space. I simply needed the access it provided because my son couldn't walk through half the parking lot carrying his wheelchair under his arm. Instead, I started documenting everything. Dates, times, license plates, photos with timestamps, weather conditions, how long each vehicle remained, whether Ethan had to wait, whether we had to unload somewhere unsafe. Every evening after dinner, I'd transfer the photos onto my laptop while Ethan finished homework beside me. Sometimes he'd ask what I was doing, And I'd simply say, keeping records. Buddy, after nearly 3 weeks, I walked into Principal Brooks's office carrying a neatly organized folder. She listened carefully as I explained everything, flipping through pages of photographs with visible concern. I honestly didn't realize it had become this frequent, she admitted. I'll address it immediately. The following Friday, every family received a reminder in the weekly school newsletter explaining that the accessible parking space was reserved at all times and unauthorized use violated district policy. For the first time in weeks, I felt hopeful. Even better, the white SUV disappeared. One day passed, then another, then a full week. 10 peaceful days. I actually started believing common sense had finally won, until one rainy Thursday afternoon when I turned into the parking lot and saw something that made my stomach sink before I even parked. The rain had already started before I pulled into the school parking lot. One of those steady gray Ohio afternoons where everything looked washed out and cold, and all I could think about was getting Ethan inside before he got soaked. Then I saw them, 2 vehicles, parked side by side across the entire accessible loading zone as if someone had intentionally staged them there. One was the same white crossover I'd been dealing with for weeks. The other was a dark blue SUV. Their drivers' windows were rolled down, and the 2 mothers were leaning toward each other, laughing in the middle of a conversation while coffee cups rested in their cup holders. They weren't loading children. They weren't unloading anything. They were simply chatting, in the one place specifically designed for people who physically couldn't manage without it. I stopped my van a few feet away and just stared for a second, almost hoping they'd notice me on their own. They didn't. Ethan looked over at me, then toward the windshield. "Again?" he asked quietly. I forced a smile that probably looked more tired than reassuring. "Looks like it." I stepped out into the rain and walked toward the white SUV. "Excuse me," I called. "I need to use the ramp." The woman looked at me as if I had interrupted something incredibly important. "We're almost done," I nodded. "I've heard that before." Her friend laughed. "Seriously? It'll be like 2 minutes." I pointed toward my van. "My son's wheelchair can't come out unless the space is clear." The woman in the blue SUV shrugged. "Can't you just park somewhere else?" It wasn't even the words anymore. It was how casually she said them, as if I had asked for a favor instead of requesting access to something protected by law. "Not safely," I answered. "That's why this space exists." The white SUV driver sighed dramatically and crossed her arms. "You know, people have kids to pick up. You're acting like the whole world has to stop for you." I looked directly at her and said something I'd replay in my mind for months afterward. Freaking no. I'm asking the world to stop pretending my son doesn't exist. For a second, neither of them spoke. Then one of their children walked out of the building, climbed into the SUV, and they both drove away without another word. No apology, no acknowledgement, just tires rolling through puddles while I pulled into the spot they'd finally vacated. But by then, the damage had already been done. The delay meant other parents had filled the surrounding traffic lanes, making it impossible to position my van correctly. I tried twice to deploy Ethan's wheelchair ramp before realizing there still wasn't enough room because another pickup had parked too close on the passenger side. I finally had to pull away completely, circle the lot twice, and find a legal parking space nearly half a block down the street. Rain soaked through my jacket before I even finished lowering the wheelchair. The sidewalk wasn't designed for accessibility. Cracks forced me to tilt the chair awkwardly. Puddles collected near broken sections of concrete, and every bump sent a small jolt through Ethan's body. He never complained. He simply held his backpack on his lap and smiled the same patient smile I'd seen far too many times in hospitals, therapy centers, and doctors' offices. That smile broke me more than tears ever could have. Halfway to the school, he quietly asked, "Dad, did I do something wrong? I actually stopped walking." "Buddy, why would you think that?" He looked down. "People always seem mad when we come." I felt something twist deep inside my chest. Kids notice everything. They hear conversations adults think they're too young to understand. They recognize uncomfortable silences. They feel the tension even when nobody says it out loud. I knelt beside his chair despite the rain pouring onto both of us. "Listen to me," I said softly. "None of this is because of you. Not 1 second of it." He studied my face for a long moment before nodding. "Okay," but I could tell he wasn't completely convinced. That conversation stayed with me all evening. After dinner, after helping him with homework, after getting him into bed, I sat alone at my kitchen table staring at the growing folder on my laptop. 43 photographs, 6 weeks of timestamps, notes documenting every incident, license plate numbers, dates, weather conditions, copies of my emails, copies of the school's newsletter reminder. Every single interaction was organized chronologically. I realized something that night. I had spent weeks trying to convince people to be considerate when I should have been asking the system to enforce the rules that already existed. There is a huge difference between requesting kindness and requiring accountability. Around 10 o'clock, I opened the district's accessibility compliance website and began filling out a formal ADA access complaint. Every field forced me to relive the past 6 weeks. Describe the obstruction. Describe the impact. Describe the frequency. Upload evidence. Explain why alternative access was inadequate. I attached every photograph, every log entry, every email. When I finally pressed submit, I leaned back in my chair and honestly felt guilty. Not because I thought I was wrong, but because I knew there was no taking it back now. Once government compliance offices become involved, things stop being friendly conversations and start becoming official investigations. The district's website explained that responses normally occurred within 15 business days. I figured maybe someone would eventually call me. 4 days later, my phone rang while I was at work. "Mr. Mercer?" a calm voice asked. "This is Angela Ruiz with the district's Accessibility Compliance Division." My stomach tightened immediately. "Yes, we've completed our preliminary review." "Completed? Already?" She explained that the volume of documented evidence, combined with the school's own acknowledgement that unauthorized vehicles had repeatedly occupied the accessible space after written reminders had been issued, required immediate action. They were investigating whether violations occurred. The evidence already answered that question. They were determining how many violations could legally be cited. I remember sitting silently while she continued explaining procedures, because none of this sounded real anymore. She informed me that district security had also reviewed camera footage corresponding to several of my timestamps. My documentation matched perfectly. Then she said something that completely surprised me. "Your records were exceptionally thorough." I laughed awkwardly. "I wish I hadn't needed to keep them." She paused before answering. "So do we." 2 days later, Principal Brooks called personally. Her voice sounded exhausted. "Daniel, I wanted you to hear this from me before rumors start spreading." Apparently, the district had identified 3 repeat offenders whose vehicles appeared over and over again throughout both surveillance footage and my documentation. Each violation carried separate civil penalties under local accessibility enforcement rules, depending on the number of documented incidents. The fines ranged from $150 to more than $200 per occurrence. Several violations had accumulated before enforcement action began. None of the parents had expected that. Mrs. Brooks also explained that the district wasn't stopping with fines. Facilities crews had already approved installation of heavy-duty steel barrier posts surrounding the accessible loading area, leaving only enough room for properly aligned accessible vehicles to enter. The school's traffic map would be permanently updated. Security staff would receive authority to immediately report future violations. In other words, the loophole parents had been exploiting for convenience was about to disappear forever. Word spread through the school faster than wildfire. By the following Monday morning, people were whispering near the entrance before classes even started. Parents who had ignored me for weeks suddenly avoided eye contact. Others stared openly as if I had somehow overreacted by expecting handicap parking to remain. Handicap parking. I even overheard one father mutter, "Some people just can't let things go." Another answered quietly, "Or maybe people shouldn't park where they're not supposed to." That was the first time in weeks I realized not everyone had been against us. Many simply hadn't understood what had actually been happening. Then, just as I was helping Ethan unload one sunny afternoon, the white crossover slowly rolled past us. The driver stopped beside my van, lowered her window, and for a brief second I honestly thought she might apologize. Instead, she looked directly at me and said, "Hope you're happy." Then she drove away. I stood there watching her disappear around the corner, while Ethan looked up at me with curious eyes. "What did she mean?" he asked. I smiled gently before pushing his wheelchair toward the entrance. "Honestly, buddy, I think one day she'll have to figure that out herself." If you'd like the conclusion with the final confrontation, the emotional payoff, and the ending that leaves viewers debating who was really right, over the next couple of weeks the parking lot almost looked like a different place. The steel barrier posts were installed on the Saturday morning, bright blue and impossible to ignore, creating a protected access lane that finally matched the purpose it had always been intended to serve. Fresh pavement markings stretched all the way to the curb. New accessibility signs were mounted higher than the old ones, and even the pickup traffic pattern had been adjusted so parents could no longer casually drift into the space while waiting for their children. The district hadn't just solved my problem. They had fixed a flaw that probably should have been addressed years earlier. The first Monday after the changes, I pulled into the lot expecting another argument out of habit. Instead, I drove straight into the accessible space without slowing down, lowered Ethan's ramp, and for the first time in almost 2 months, there wasn't a single obstacle between my son and the school entrance. No horns, no awkward conversations, no waiting, no pretending everything was fine while people treated accessibility like an optional courtesy. Ethan rolled down the ramp, looked around, and smiled. That was easy. 4 simple words. Most parents would never think twice about them, but I had to look away for a second because I could actually feel my eyes burning. Easy. That was all I had wanted. Not special treatment, not revenge. Just one ordinary school morning where my son didn't have to wonder whether someone else's convenience mattered more than his ability to get to class. A few days later, Principal Evelyn Brooks stopped me outside the office. She looked genuinely relieved, though there was still a trace of guilt in her expression. "Daniel," she said quietly, "I owe you another apology." I shook my head. "You already apologized." "Not enough," she answered. "I kept thinking a reminder email would solve it because I wanted to believe parents would do the right thing once they understood. I should have realized sooner that some people only change when there's accountability." I appreciated her honesty more than she probably realized. She hadn't tried to defend herself or shift the blame. She admitted the system had moved too slowly. And because of that, Ethan had paid the price. Before we walked away, she added something that stayed with me. "The district is reviewing every elementary school now. They're checking accessible loading zones across the county because of your complaint." I hadn't expected that. I thought I was protecting one parking space. Instead, it turned out our experience had exposed a much larger issue. A month later, I ran into one of the crossing guards who had watched the entire situation unfold from the beginning. She smiled as Ethan rolled toward the entrance and quietly said, "I've been working here almost 15 years. You're the first parent who actually made them fix something instead of just complaining about it." That sentence made me think. There's a difference between complaining and documenting. Complaining asks someone to believe your story. Documentation allows the facts to tell it for you. I never yelled in the parking lot. I never posted anyone's face online. I never tried to embarrass anybody on social media. I simply collected evidence, followed the proper procedures, and allowed the people responsible for enforcing the rules to do exactly that. Looking back, I still remember the woman in the white crossover telling me, "You hope you're happy." The funny thing is, happiness was never really the point. I don't wake up smiling because 3 parents received expensive citations. In fact, I honestly wish none of them had. I wish the very first time I politely asked someone to move, they had looked over at Ethan sitting patiently in the van and simply said, "I'm sorry." That would have been the end of the story. No investigation, no fines, no barrier posts, no district review. Just one small act of consideration. But that's not what happened. Instead, several adults decided that 8 minutes of convenience mattered more than a child's safe access to school. And eventually they learned that ignoring accessibility laws can become very expensive. As for Ethan, he hasn't mentioned those stressful afternoons in a long time. Kids are remarkably resilient when adults stop putting obstacles in front of them. These days, he mostly talks about science class, video games, and whether the cafeteria pizza is actually getting better or if his friends are just lowering their standards. That's exactly how it should be. A 12-year-old should spend his energy worrying about math tests and recess, not wondering whether someone parked in the only place that allows him to get into school safely. Every now and then, when I pull into that blue space, I still think about those 6 weeks. Not because I'm angry anymore, but because they reminded me of something I hope I never forget. Accessibility isn't about giving certain people extra privileges. It's about removing barriers that never should have existed in the first place. When someone ignores that, they're not stealing a parking space. They're stealing independence, dignity, and time from people who already have to fight harder for all 3. So now I want to ask you something. If you had been in my position, would you have filed the formal complaint after the very first incident? Or would you have done exactly what I did and spent 6 weeks giving people chance after chance before finally involving the district? Do you think those parents deserve the fines they received? Or do you believe the school should have handled it differently before legal enforcement became necessary? Share your thoughts in the comments because I genuinely like to know where you stand. And if this story meant something to you, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who still believes that doing the right thing is usually easier than dealing with the consequences of refusing to do it.